Chapter 1. The Bridge That Devours. The sun hung low in the sky as Li Wei's car rumbled into Black Willow Village. Nestled deep in the misty mountains of Sichuan, the place was small, its narrow streets lined with aged wooden houses, their tiled roofs curved like dragon spines. The air smelled of damp earth and incense, the kind villagers burned to ward off spirits. Li Wei, a seasoned journalist with China Paranormal Weekly, had traveled across the country debunking ghost stories. Superstitions, urban legends, ancient myths, he had heard them all, and none had ever been real. That's why when he first read about the Red Bridge of Black Willow, he dismissed it as just another village folktale. Those who step onto the bridge after sunset never reach the other side. The legend claimed that people would walk endlessly, as if trapped in an infinite loop, until something found them. No one who had vanished was ever seen again. Those who had returned spoke in whispers, their hair turned white overnight, their minds shattered. It was perfect material for his next article. The warnings begin. Stopping at a local tea house, Li Wei took out his notebook and approached the elderly owner, Auntie Chen. She regarded him warily as he asked about the bridge. Her hands trembled slightly as she refilled a cup. "You shouldn't go there." Li Wei gave her a polite smile. "Why not?" Auntie Chen's eyes darted to the window. Outside, the red bridge loomed in the distance, stretching over a black, motionless river. The setting sun stained the sky crimson, bathing the bridge in an eerie glow. "Because the bridge is hungry," she whispered. Li Wei chuckled. "Bridges don't eat people, Auntie." She didn't laugh. Instead, she leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "The demon beneath it does." The tea house grew silent. Other villagers lowered their heads, refusing to meet his gaze. "Every few years, someone vanishes," Auntie Chen continued, stirring her tea absently. "They say it takes those who walk alone. First, the air grows heavy. Then, the steps behind you start. No matter how fast you walk, it walks faster." Li Wei raised an eyebrow. "And has anyone actually seen this demon?" Auntie Chen didn't answer. Instead, she pulled out something from her pocket, a yellow talisman covered in faded red ink. "Take this." "For what?" Her eyes darkened. "To keep it from following you home." The forbidden path. Despite the ominous warnings, Li Wei's curiosity burned. He left the tea house and made his way toward the red bridge. It was older than he expected, its wooden planks darkened with time. Crimson railings lined its sides, chipped and worn, but still standing strong. The river below was unnervingly still, a black mirror reflecting the darkening sky. A sudden chill crept over him. The temperature had dropped. Taking a deep breath, Li Wei stepped forward, his shoes clicking against the wood. The villagers' warnings were nonsense. He would cross the bridge, reach the other side, and prove once again that ghost stories were just that, stories. As he reached the middle of the bridge, a gust of wind howled through the valley, making the red lanterns hanging from the railing sway violently. The wood beneath his feet creaked, as if shifting under his weight. Then, a whisper, a breath, right behind his ear. Li Wei froze. The hair on his arms stood up. He was alone, or so he thought, because when he took another step, he heard it. Another step, directly behind him. Click. His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, ever so slowly, he turned around. But the bridge was empty. The other side of the bridge seemed farther away than before. The air felt heavier, pressing against his skin, planks beneath him stretched endlessly into the fog. And then he heard it again. Click, click, click. The sound of bare feet slapping against the wood. Coming closer. Li Wei's heartbeat hammered against his ribs as he realized something. The bridge had only one entrance and one exit. No one had followed him onto it. So then, who was walking behind him? Chapter 2. The sound of another step. Li Wei's breath came out in short, shallow bursts. The air around him felt thick and suffocating, like the weight of something unseen pressing against his chest. The sound of bare footsteps, soft, damp, and deliberate, continued behind him. Click, click, click. His rational mind screamed that it had to be an echo, a trick of the acoustics on the bridge. But then he noticed something. The steps didn't match his own. They came a fraction of a second after he moved, as if someone was copying him, or following him. Slowly, he turned his head, just enough to glance over his shoulder. Nothing. The bridge was empty. The red railing stretched behind him, disappearing into the thickening mist. The river below was black and unmoving, a still mirror reflecting the eerie glow of the setting sun. And yet, click. This time, the step came before he moved. Li Wei's stomach twisted into a knot. That wasn't an echo. A cold sweat trickled down his neck. His fingers instinctively reached into his pocket, brushing against the yellow talisman Auntie Chen had given him. He clenched it tightly. He had laughed at her warning, but now he wasn't so sure. Trapped on the bridge, Li Wei forced himself to keep walking, his pace quickening. The bridge wasn't long. He had seen it from the village. It should have only taken a minute to cross. But as he walked, the far end of the bridge remained just as distant as before. His steps faltered. Was he imagining it? He turned again, still nothing. But then he noticed something unsettling. The red lanterns lining the bridge had changed. When he first stepped onto the bridge, there had only been a few of them, hanging lazily from the wooden posts. But now, there were more, many more. They lined the entire bridge, glowing dimly, their paper skin pulsing as if breathing. And then they flickered. For a brief second, the lanterns went dark. In that instant, Li Wei saw something. A shadow, tall, elongated, standing right behind him. The lanterns flared back to life. The shadow was gone. Li Wei's hands trembled. The cold sweat on his skin made his clothes stick to him. He no longer cared about the article, the legend, or proving the villagers wrong. He just wanted to get off this bridge. Heart pounding, he broke into a run. The endless walk. The wooden planks creaked violently under his feet as he sprinted. The red railing blurred past him, the cold air whipping against his face. And yet, the other end of the bridge never got any closer. It was endless. No, 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 no. Li Wei gasped, his legs burning. He had been running for minutes, but the village behind him had disappeared into darkness, and the far side of the bridge remained unreachable. Then, a giggle, a sickly, sweet, childlike giggle, right behind his ear. Li Wei skidded to a stop, his breath caught in his throat. A voice whispered, so close he could feel the cold breath on his neck. "Where are you going?" Li Wei whipped around. For the first time, he saw it. A woman, or rather, something that used to be a woman. She stood in the middle of the bridge, barefoot, her white robes stained with wet black splotches. Her hair was long, tangled face. But what made Li Wei's stomach drop was her feet. They were facing the wrong way. She took a step forward, her head tilting unnaturally to the side. Click, the same sound he had been hearing all along. Li Wei stumbled back, his pulse hammering in his ears. His fingers fumbled for his phone. If he could capture this, if he could just document this, maybe it would be enough proof to His phone slipped from his grasp. He barely had time to react before the woman moved. Not walked, glided. 1 second, she was several meters away. The next, she was directly in front of him. Cold, decaying fingers brushed against his arm. Li Wei screamed. The river below instinct took over. He ran to the edge of the bridge, gripping the red railing with both hands. The river stared back at him, a deep black abyss. There was no other way. He jumped. The wind roared in his ears. He expected the icy shock of water, the suffocating pull of the river, the sting of his body crashing into the surface. Instead, he landed back on the bridge, right where he had started. The woman was still there, standing where he had left her. This time, her head was completely upside down. She smiled. "You can't leave." The lanterns flickered again. The mist thickened. And then, behind her, the railing of the bridge creaked open. Something was crawling up from the river below. Something much worse. Chapter 3. The Thing Beneath the Bridge. Li Wei's body trembled violently. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths as his mind struggled to comprehend the impossible. He had jumped. He should have fallen into the river. And yet, he was still on the bridge, still trapped. The woman, or whatever she was, stood a few meters away, her white robes swaying in a wind that didn't exist. Her head was completely upside down, her tangled black hair hanging toward the sky. Through the strands, a smile stretched across her face. Too wide, too unnatural. But Li Wei's attention was no longer on her, because behind her, something else was coming. The horror crawling up. The wooden railing of the bridge groaned and cracked as thin, bony fingers emerged from beneath. At first, just one hand, then another, then a third. Something was pulling itself up from the river below. Li Wei's entire body seized with terror as he saw its arms. They were too long, too many, and too thin, as if its skin had dried and stretched over brittle bones. Each finger ended in a long, splintered nail, like a corpse buried for centuries. Then came its head. It rose slowly, first revealing a scalp peeled open, exposing wet red muscle. The skin that remained was grayish, sagging, and stitched together with thick black thread. Its mouth was too wide, the lips torn and curled back, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. And its eyes. They were not in the right place. One bulged from its forehead. The other was on its cheek. Both locked onto Li Wei. And then it grinned. A wet, gurgling sound erupted from its throat as its third arm reached up, digging cracked nails into the bridge's planks. Li Wei's breath hitched. The woman's smile widened. She took one step back, closer to the creature. Then, in a voice that sounded like a chorus of whispers, she said, "He's yours now." The creature lurched forward. The chase begins. Li Wei bolted. He didn't think. He just ran. Faster than he had ever run in his life. His shoes pounded against the bridge, his heart hammering so violently that his chest ached. But no matter how fast he ran, the other side of the bridge never came. The lanterns above began flickering wildly. The mist thickened, swirling like smoke, making it impossible to see ahead. bridge felt longer. Then, thump, 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 the sound of something crawling on all fours. It was chasing him. Li Wei dared not turn around, but he could hear it, the wet, sickening sound of its hands and feet slapping against the wood, the way its nails scraped against the planks. Then came the whispers, soft at first, then louder. "Don't run. Let us in. Give us your skin." A scream built in Li Wei's throat, but he bit it down and ran even faster. Then his foot hit something. He tripped. His body slammed into the bridge, pain shooting through his knees and elbows. His hands scraped against the rough wood. His phone. It lay just inches away, screen cracked but still glowing. And on the screen, he saw the reflection of the thing behind him. It was on the ceiling of the bridge, crawling upside down like a spider, and it was inches away. The whispering talisman Li Wei lunged for his phone, gripping it tightly as he scrambled to his feet. His pulse thundered in his ears. He had no plan, no idea how to escape. Then his fingers brushed against something else. The talisman, the one Auntie Chen had given him, the crumpled yellow paper marked with ancient red ink, his last hope. Without thinking, he turned and slammed it against the creature's face. A horrific shriek erupted through the air. The creature reeled back, its skin burning where the talisman touched it. The symbols on the paper flared a deep blood red. The woman screamed as well, covering her face as if she too was burning. And in that instant, the mist began to clear, the bridge shifted, and suddenly the other side was right there. Li Wei didn't hesitate. He ran. This time, the bridge let him go. Back to the village, Li Wei stumbled off the bridge, falling onto the dirt path. His hands dug into the earth as he gasped for air, his entire body trembling violently. When he looked back, the bridge was empty. The woman was gone. The creature was gone. The red lanterns were still, their glow soft and undisturbed. The mist had disappeared, revealing the peaceful, sleeping village in the distance. It was as if nothing had ever happened, but it did. Li Wei looked down at his hands. His fingers were still curled around the talisman, and his phone, still cracked, showed a blurry, distorted image. An image of a face with too many eyes, staring, watching, waiting. Chapter 4. The Village's Secret. Li Wei sat on the ground, his body still trembling from the nightmare he had just escaped. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. The bridge behind him was silent. No woman, no creature, no mist. It was as if nothing had happened, but Li Wei knew better. He looked down at his hands. His fingers were clenched so tightly around the talisman that his knuckles had turned white. The yellow paper was now blackened, the red ink smudged as if it had absorbed something dark. His phone, still cracked from the fall, lay in the dirt beside him. The screen was frozen on a distorted image, a face, too many eyes, staring, watching. Li Wei's stomach twisted. He scrambled to his feet, his legs weak and shaking. He had to get away from here. He turned toward the village and ran. The old woman's warning. The village was eerily quiet. The moment Li Wei stepped onto the main street, he noticed something strange. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the entire village was holding its breath. The streets were empty. No villagers chatting outside their homes. No children playing near the wells. Even the cicadas had gone silent. A shiver ran down Li Wei's spine. Then, "You saw it, didn't you?" Li Wei spun around. A hunched old woman stood in the shadows of a nearby house, her wrinkled face pale in the dim lantern light. Her cloudy eyes bore into him, unblinking. "The thing under the bridge," she whispered. Li Wei's mouth felt dry. He didn't know how to respond. The old woman stepped closer, her voice dropping lower. "You should not have gone there, boy." He swallowed hard. What was that thing? The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. She grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Come with me, now." A dark tale. The woman led him through the narrow alleyways, past dimly lit homes and silent doorways. The deeper they went, the more the air smelled of incense and old wood. They stopped at a small, candle-lit room. It was filled with paper talismans, stacks of dried herbs, and bowls of red ink. Li Wei's stomach churned. This wasn't just any home. It was a shrine. The woman gestured for him to sit. Then, with a heavy sigh, she began her story. Long ago, this village was cursed. Li Wei felt his pulse quicken. There was a woman, a widow. She lived near the river, tending to the bridge that connected our village to the outside world. The woman's hands trembled as she reached for a wooden box, pulling out a faded, old painting. It showed a young woman dressed in white robes. Her long black hair covered most of her face. The villagers feared her. The old woman's voice grew softer. They said she spoke to things that lived beneath the water, that she could hear whispers when no one else could. Li Wei clenched his fists. And the creature? The woman's lips quivered. It was her husband. A chill ran down Li Wei's spine. She was once married to a man who drowned in the river. They never found his body. But soon after, people started seeing something. Her voice wavered. Something that walked on all fours, that had too many arms, that whispered in the voices of the dead. Li Wei's stomach twisted. The villagers believed she had called him back, that she had brought him from the depths, but he was no longer human. The woman's eyes darkened, so they killed her. The curse lives on. A heavy silence filled the room. Li Wei's hands clenched into fists, and now she haunts the bridge. The woman nodded slowly, but not just her. The thing she brought back still lingers. Li Wei's breath hitched. It waits for those who cross the bridge alone. It whispers to them, calls them by name, and if they answer, she leaned in. They never leave the bridge. The words sent ice through Li Wei's veins. He remembered the whispers, the feeling of something breathing down his neck, the way the bridge never ended. He shouldn't be alive. The old woman grabbed his wrist again, her grip like iron. "Listen to me, boy." Her voice was urgent. "You survived because of that." She pointed at the talisman in his hand. "But it won't protect you forever." Li Wei swallowed hard. "Then how do I end this?" The old woman hesitated. Then she whispered, "You must find her grave and burn what remains." Li Wei's heart pounded. The widow's grave. He had a feeling that finding it wouldn't be easy, because if the legends were true, she didn't want to be found. Chapter 5. The Widow's Grave. Li Wei barely slept that night. His mind was a storm of whispers, twisted faces, and the thing that crawled beneath the bridge. The old woman's words echoed in his head. You must find her grave and burn what remains. But how? Where would he even start? The village was ancient, its history buried under layers of superstition and fear. And if no one dared to cross the bridge at night, then surely no one would dare to go looking for her grave. And yet, if he didn't, that his way through the village, searching for anything that could lead him to the widow's grave. He kept his head low, avoiding the wary gazes of the villagers. They knew what had happened to him last night, and they were afraid. Only one person was willing to talk, a hunched, middle-aged man who worked at the old shrine near the river. When Li Wei asked him about the widow's grave, the man flinched. His eyes darted around as if checking for unseen ears. Then, in a hushed voice, he said, "You shouldn't be asking about that." Li Wei held his breath. "Please, I need to find it." The man hesitated. Then, finally, he whispered, "There's an abandoned path. It leads into the forest east of the village." His voice shook. "That's where they buried her. But no one goes there." Li Wei's stomach twisted. He knew where he had to go. The forest of the dead. The path was exactly as the man described, forgotten, overgrown, and cursed with an eerie silence. Li Wei felt his skin prickle as he stepped forward. The trees twisted unnaturally, their roots curling like skeletal fingers. The deeper he went, the colder the air became, as if the forest itself was rejecting him. Then he saw them, small, crumbling stone markers hidden beneath moss and dead leaves. Graves. They were ancient, barely readable, and yet one stood out. A larger gravestone, cracked down the middle, covered in strange symbols. Its surface was blackened, as if burned by fire. Li Wei's heart pounded. He brushed the dirt away, revealing the name carved into the stone. Zhao Meilan, the widow. This was it, the whispering soil. Li Wei swallowed hard and reached into his bag. He had brought a lighter and incense sticks, hoping they would be enough. His fingers trembled as he lit the incense, placing them before the grave. Then he began to dig. The earth was unnaturally cold, even though the sun was rising. Each handful of dirt felt wrong, as if something was watching him. Then his fingers hit wood, a coffin. But before he could react, the air shifted, the trees groaned, and a voice, low, whispering, broken, rose from the grave. "Why are you here?" Li Wei froze. His breath hitched as the coffin creaked. The lid began to move. Then a hand emerged, thin, bone-white, fingernails long and cracked. Li Wei stumbled back. The hand clawed at the air, pushing the coffin open. And from the darkness inside, a figure sat up. Her face was hidden beneath long, matted hair, but her eyes, milky white, unblinking, fixed on him. Then, in a voice that rattled like dry bones, she whispered, "You should not have come." The grave awakens. Li Wei's body screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. The widow rose fully from the coffin, her white burial robes tattered and stained. The symbols on her grave glowed a deep, sickly red. Then she took a step forward. Her bare feet sank into the soil, turning it black. Li Wei's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a ghost. She was something worse. The air thickened. A deep, wet whisper slithered through the trees. "She's awake." Li Wei's blood ran cold. That voice, he knew it. The thing beneath the bridge. It had followed him here. And now, it was coming. Chapter 6. The thing beneath the soil. The forest felt wrong. The air around Li Wei grew thick and heavy, like a weight pressing down on his chest. He could hear the leaves rustling, but there was no wind. The shadows between the trees twisted unnaturally, stretching toward him. And the widow was standing right in front of him. Her pale, bony fingers reached out, her milky white eyes unblinking. The Tattered funeral robes hung loosely from her fragile frame, the fabric stained dark with something old, something rotten. Li Wei's throat went dry. He had dug up her grave, and now she was awake, the thing that whispers. Then, from the trees behind him, it came, the whisper, low, wet, like something dragging itself through mud. She's awake. Li Wei's stomach twisted. The voice was wrong. It was neither male nor female, neither close nor far. It echoed as if spoken from somewhere beneath the ground. Then he heard it, a slithering sound, something crawling. His body screamed at him to run, but he couldn't. The widow was still staring at him. And then she moved. Her head jerked to the side with a sickening crack. Her fingers twitched. Her lips, dry and cracked, parted. You should not have come. Her voice was layered, like multiple voices speaking at once. Some wept, some whispered, some laughed. The whispers in the forest grew louder. Li Wei felt something cold wrap around his ankle. He looked down and nearly screamed. A hand. No, not a hand. It was too long, too thin. Its fingers stretched unnaturally far, the nails sharp and blackened. The skin was wet, glistening, stitched together with thick black thread, and it was pulling him down. Buried in the earth, panic surged through Li Wei's body. He kicked violently, trying to free himself. The thing beneath the soil tightened its grip. More hands began to emerge from the dirt, some small and childlike, some twisted and broken, some missing fingers. They reached for him, for his legs, for his arms, for his face. Li Wei let out a choked scream. The widow tilted her head, watching him with a strange, unnatural stillness. He is calling you. Her voice was distant, almost sad. Li Wei's heart pounded. Who? She didn't answer, because the thing beneath the ground finally emerged. A face. No, many faces. Its flesh was stitched together, mouths forming where they shouldn't be. Some grinned with rotting teeth, others gasped soundlessly, as if still drowning. And the eyes. Too many. Too human. Too hungry. The thing lurched upward, its many arms crawling toward him. The smell of wet earth, decay, and river water filled his lungs. And then it spoke. Come back to us. The voices weren't distant anymore. They were inside his head. A desperate escape, Li Wei's vision blurred. His mind twisted. For a moment, he saw water, deep, dark, endless. He was sinking, arms wrapped around him. A familiar voice whispered in his ear. Come back. We're still waiting. Li Wei's lungs burned. He couldn't breathe. Then, a sharp pain snapped him back to reality. The widow had grabbed his wrist. Her nails dug into his skin, drawing blood. Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, she looked afraid. Run. Li Wei didn't hesitate. He tore himself free from the grasping hands, from the whispers, from the thing in the soil. His legs burned as he ran, stumbling through the graveyard, crashing through the undergrowth. The whispers followed. The trees groaned. And just as he reached the edge of the forest, everything went silent. The village's Fear Li Wei collapsed on the dirt road, his body shaking. His breath came in ragged gasps. The village was ahead, but the moment he stepped onto the main street, the villagers were waiting for him. Their faces were grim. Some looked angry, others terrified. The old woman from before stepped forward, her hands clutching a talisman. You fool. Her voice trembled. You woke her up. Li Wei swallowed hard. The sky above darkened. A low, distant whisper slithered through the air. The villagers flinched. Li Wei's stomach dropped. It had followed him. Chapter 7. The Curse That Follows. Li Wei's body was trembling. His mind screamed for him to run, but where? The thing from the forest had followed him. The widow had awoken, and now the entire village stood before him, watching. The old woman gripped her talisman tightly, her wrinkled hands shaking. Her eyes, filled with fear and anger, locked onto him. "You've doomed us all," the villagers whispered among themselves. Some made protective gestures, others avoided looking directly at Li Wei. Then, from behind him, the whisper returned. Low, wet. "He belongs to us." A gust of wind howled through the village, though the trees didn't move. The sky darkened, as if something ancient had awakened and was now watching. Li Wei felt cold fingers brush against the back of his neck. And suddenly, everything went black. The ghost's memory. When Li Wei opened his eyes, he was somewhere else. The village was gone. Instead, he stood in a dimly lit house, filled with the scent of incense and decay. The wooden walls were cracked, candles flickered, casting strange shadows. And then he saw her, the widow, but she wasn't pale and rotting. She was alive, a beautiful woman dressed in an elegant but tattered red silk robe. Her long black hair cascaded down her back, but her eyes, they were filled with sorrow. She sat at a wooden table, staring down at something in her hands. A wedding ribbon stained with blood. Then the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. She lifted her head. The door creaked open. A man entered. Li Wei couldn't see his face, only the gleam of a long, curved knife in his hand. The widow didn't scream. She simply whispered something, her voice filled with sadness. Then the blade fell. The room collapsed into darkness. And when Li Wei opened his eyes again, he was back in the village, the truth unveiled. He gasped, his chest burning. His clothes were drenched in sweat. The villagers still stood around him, watching with hollow eyes. The old woman knelt beside him, her voice urgent. "What did you see?" Li Wei struggled to find the words. "She was murdered." The villagers exchanged fearful glances. The old woman sighed deeply. "We knew." Li Wei's breath caught in his throat. Then why? Boom! A sudden thunderclap echoed from the mountains. And then the bell at the village shrine began to ring. But no one had touched it. The villagers froze. Their faces turned ashen. The old woman's eyes widened. "It's too late." Li Wei swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" She turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "The curse has already begun." The wind howled, and from the direction of the forest, something was coming. Something hungry. Something that had waited for years. Chapter 8. The Unseen Hunger. A deathly silence fell over the village. Li Wei could hear his own heartbeat, pounding like a drum inside his ears. The bell at the village shrine continued to toll, though there was no wind, no hands touching it. The old woman turned to the villagers. "Prepare the talismans. Bring the incense." Some immediately rushed into their homes. Others stood frozen, their faces drained of color. Li Wei forced himself to speak. "What's happening?" The old woman didn't look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on the darkened road leading to the forest, waiting, listening. The thing that was buried, it has woken up, and it is hungry. A low growl rumbled through the air, not from an animal, but something else, something ancient. And then, the first scream tore through the night. The first death Li Wei turned just in time to see a man being dragged into the darkness. He didn't even have time to fight. One moment, he was standing among the villagers, and the next, something yanked him into the shadows. His scream was cut short. All that was left behind was a deep trail in the dirt, a trail leading toward the forest. The villagers panicked. Some ran into their houses, barring their doors. Others grabbed burning torches and talismans, their hands shaking. The whispering started again, soft at first, then louder. And suddenly, Li Wei wasn't sure if the voices were coming from the forest or from inside his own head. The eyes that watch. The old woman grabbed Li Wei's arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Come with me, now." She pulled him toward the village shrine, where a massive bronze bell stood at the center. The smoke of burning incense curled around the air, but the moment they stepped inside, the flames of the candles flickered violently, as if disturbed by something unseen. The old woman shoved Li Wei inside and locked the doors. "They cannot enter sacred ground," she murmured. "For now." Li Wei pressed his back against the wooden wall, trying to steady his breathing. "What the hell are they?" The old woman exhaled, finally meeting his gaze. "The ones who were buried without a name." She gestured toward the center of the shrine, where a stone tablet stood. Unlike the other graves in the village, this one had no name, only a single red ribbon tied around it. Li Wei's stomach twisted. The widow's ribbon, the sin of the village. The old woman knelt before the nameless tablet, placing her hands together in prayer. "Long ago, this village committed a sin," she whispered. "A man came here, seeking refuge. He was injured, his face burned beyond recognition. We did not know his name, nor did we ask. He begged us for help." Her voice grew heavy, but we turned him away. Li Wei frowned. "Why?" She closed her eyes. "We were afraid. They say the man was a cursed soul, one who had escaped from the underworld. That if we let him stay, he would bring death to the village. So, on the night of the red moon, we sealed him inside the ground." Li Wei felt his blood turn ice cold. "You buried him alive?" The old woman nodded, her face filled with deep sorrow. "But death does not forget." She motioned toward the bell. "Every year, on the night of the red moon, it rings on its own." Li Wei stared at it, the weight of realization pressing on his chest. "Because his soul is still here." The old woman nodded. "And tonight, he is not alone." The hands that reach. Suddenly, a thump echoed against the shrine doors. Then another, and another. Li Wei's breath hitched. "They're here." The wood began to splinter, and then a hand burst through. But it wasn't human. The fingers were too long. The nails jagged and cracked. The flesh was stitched together as if made from different bodies. And the worst part, it wasn't alone. From the cracks in the wood, dozens of eyes peered through, some old, some young, some still filled with tears. They blinked in unison, and then a chorus of voices whispered from the darkness, "Come back to us, Li Wei." His heart stopped, because among the voices, he heard one that was all too familiar. His brothers. Chapter 9. The Voices of the Dead. The whispers wrapped around Li Wei like cold hands, pulling at his sanity. His breath caught in his throat. The voice he had just heard. It couldn't be. His brother, Jian. Impossible. Jian had died years ago, and yet, the voice that whispered his name was unmistakable. "Li Wei, come with me. I've been waiting. The rotting hands clawed at the shrine doors, splintering the wood, their nails digging into the cracks. The eyeless faces pushed through the openings, their mouths moving in silent agony. The bell above them tolled again, deep, heavy, unnatural. The old woman clutched her prayer beads, muttering frantic incantations. But even she was shaking. Li Wei stumbled back, his mind racing. Was he losing his grip on reality? Or had the dead really come for him? The widow's bargain. Then something changed. A sudden stillness fell over the shrine. The whispering ceased. Even the creatures outside the door stopped moving. And in that eerie silence, a figure stepped forward. The widow. She stood among the horrors, her red silk robe tattered and stained, her once beautiful face half decayed. But her eyes were alive. They burned with something deeper than rage, sorrow. Li Wei felt his body freeze. He wanted to speak, but no sound left his lips. The widow tilted her head, and then, in a voice that was both gentle and horrifying, she spoke. I can bring him back. Li Wei's heart stopped. What? She took a step closer. The creatures around her parted as if she commanded them. Your brother. Her lips curled into something that was almost a smile. I can return him to you. A part of Li Wei knew this was a trap. But another part, a desperate, broken part, wanted to believe. He had spent years mourning Jian, years blaming himself, and now, standing before him, was a chance to undo the past, a choice in the dark. The old woman's voice snapped him back. Don't listen to her. She grabbed his wrist, her grip tighter than before. She's lying. It's not your brother anymore. But the widow didn't move. Instead, she lifted her hand, and behind her, a shape began to emerge. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward. A young man. Jian. His face was exactly the same as Li Wei remembered. His dark hair, his kind eyes, untouched by death. Li Wei's knees nearly gave out. Jian. Jian smiled, stepping closer. It's me, Li Wei. The old woman gasped, shaking her head furiously. No. This isn't real. Jian's expression didn't change. He looked at Li Wei with a gaze that was both familiar and empty. Come with me, brother. Li Wei felt something inside him break. The last time he had seen Jian, he was lying lifeless in a river, his hands pale, his lips blue. And now he stood before him, whole, alive. Did it matter if this was a trick? Did it matter if it wasn't real? Tears blurred Li Wei's vision. His fingers trembled as he reached out. The truth revealed. The old woman screamed. Li Wei, no! But it was too late. Li Wei's hand touched Jian's, and the moment he did, everything shattered. Jian's face twisted. His skin split open like cracked porcelain, revealing something rotten underneath. His smile stretched too wide. His eyes turned black. And then, a voice, not his brother's, but something else, whispered, Mine. Pain exploded through Li Wei's chest. Something cold wrapped around his heart, tightening, squeezing, pulling. And in that moment, he understood. Jian had never returned. This thing was never his brother. The widow had deceived him. And now it was claiming him. Chapter 10. The Price of the Dead. Li Wei's body convulsed. His breath came in ragged gasps as an unbearable coldness spread from his chest, seeping into his veins. The thing wearing Jian's face tightened its grip on his hand, and Li Wei felt something inside him breaking. Not his bones, but something deeper. His soul. The widow stood motionless, watching with cold amusement. You wanted your brother, did you not? She whispered, Now you will join him." Li Wei tried to scream, but no sound came out. His vision blurred, the world spinning as his mind fought against the unseen force dragging him into the abyss. And then, a deafening crack. The shrine bell shattered. The ritual begins. The old woman moved faster than Li Wei thought possible. With a sharp cry, she slammed a talisman onto his chest. The moment the paper touched his skin, a golden light erupted, pushing the creature back. Jian's face twisted in fury. His once kind eyes burned with hatred. The widow snarled, "Foolish old woman, you cannot stop fate." But the old woman wasn't listening. She began chanting, her voice growing louder. The shrine shook, the spirits outside screamed, and then the widow's form flickered. For the first time, Li Wei saw it, her true self. Her once beautiful skin was rotting. Her face was nothing more than a hollow skull, her eyes two burning pits of red, and wrapped around her body were hundreds of withered arms, grasping, reaching, the souls she had devoured. Li Wei's stomach churned. She wasn't just a ghost, she was something far worse, a soul eater. And now she had set her eyes on him, the binding circle. The old woman grabbed Li Wei by the wrist and dragged him toward the center of the shrine. There, etched into the wooden floor, was an ancient symbol, a binding circle. "Get inside, now," she commanded. Li Wei stumbled, barely managing to step inside before the doors exploded inward. The spirits flooded into the shrine, their mouths open in silent wails. They clawed at the air, reaching for him. But the moment they touched the circle, they burned. Shrieking, they recoiled, their forms flickering. Li Wei's chest heaved. He had never seen anything like it. The old woman threw more talismans around the room, her voice never stopping its chant. The spirits twisted and howled, but they could not step into the circle. But the widow smiled. "You think your spells can stop me?" she hissed. She raised her hand, and suddenly, the air grew thick. The flames of the candles died, and the shadows in the room began to move. The shadow that devours. From the darkness behind the widow, something began to rise. It was not human. It was not even a ghost. It was a void, a presence so overwhelming that Li Wei felt his knees go weak. The air grew heavy with the scent of decay. And then it spoke, a voice so deep, so ancient, that it felt like it came from the earth itself. "Return what was taken," the old woman gasped, her face pale. "No, it cannot be." Li Wei turned to her, his heart pounding. "What is it?" She swallowed hard. The thing buried beneath this village. Her voice trembled. It was never human. Chapter 11. The Awakening of the Nameless One. The shrine shuddered. The air thickened with the scent of rot, and the shadows stretched unnaturally across the wooden floor. Li Wei's breath hitched as he felt something ancient, something watching. And then it moved. The darkness behind the widow split open like a gaping maw. A form emerged, massive, shifting, unnatural. It had no face, no defined features, only a crawling mass of writhing limbs and hollowed-out skulls. Its voice was not a sound, but a vibration deep within the bones. "Return what was taken." The widow staggered back. For the first time, her expression faltered. She had not expected this. The forgotten curse. The old woman's face was pale, her hands trembling as she pressed more talismans to the ground. Her voice wavered as she spoke. Li Wei listened carefully. She kept her gaze on the creature, but her words were for him. "That thing is older than the widow, older than this village. It was never meant to wake. Li Wei's throat was dry. What do you mean? The old woman's lips parted, but before she could answer, the widow lunged forward. You dare summon it? She shrieked, her decayed body twisting unnaturally. She reached for the old woman, her fingers lengthening into razor-sharp claws. The old woman barely managed to dodge, but the attack was enough to shatter the talisman barrier. The spirits rushed in. A dozen spectral hands clawed at Li Wei. He stumbled back, feeling their cold touch pulling at his flesh, his soul. But something else happened, something even worse. The creature in the darkness began to laugh. The truth beneath the village. The laughter was wrong. It wasn't human. It wasn't even from this world. The shadows rippled as the voice spoke again, each word feeling like it was burrowing into Li Wei's skull. She broke the pact. Li Wei felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if something inside him was being torn apart. The old woman's voice cracked. Li Wei, don't listen. She's been feeding it for years. Li Wei turned toward the widow, horror dawning on him. The spirits, the endless deaths, the nightmares that plagued this land. She had been offering souls to keep it asleep, but now it had woken, and it was hungry. A choice between damnation and sacrifice. The widow's once calm demeanor shattered. Her rotting lips curled in a snarl. I did what I had to. You don't know what it is capable of. The creature's form slithered forward, tendrils of darkness spreading across the shrine. The walls began to decay. The wooden beams collapsed into ash. The entire shrine was rotting away. The old woman grabbed Li Wei's wrist, her grip tight and desperate. We must seal it now. But Li Wei hesitated. The widow's eyes burned into him. Help me, Li Wei. You wanted your brother back, didn't you? I can still bring him back. Li Wei's heart pounded violently. The old woman's voice was urgent. If we don't stop it, it will consume everything. The creature was watching, waiting. It didn't care who won. It only wanted to feed. Li Wei clenched his fists, and then he made his choice. Chapter 12. The Final Offering. The shrine was collapsing. The very air quivered with the weight of something ancient, something never meant to wake. The Nameless One loomed above them, a shifting mass of writhing shadows and countless hollowed-out skulls. It did not move, yet its presence was everywhere, watching, waiting. Li Wei's mind raced. The widow's rotting hand reached for him, her eyes wild. Li Wei, I can give you what you want. Your brother, your family. I can bring them back. The old woman gripped his arm. Her voice was urgent, trembling. No soul can return once taken. She's lying to you. If you help her, this thing will never stop feeding. Li Wei's breath was ragged. His chest ached as though something inside him was being pulled apart. He had to choose. But in the end, there was only one choice. The widow's betrayal. With a sudden burst of strength, Li Wei ripped himself free from the widow's grasp. She lunged at him with inhuman speed, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide, far too wide. But Li Wei was faster. He slammed a talisman against her forehead. The moment the paper touched her rotting skin, her body convulsed. She screamed, a horrible, wailing cry that echoed through the shrine. Her flesh began to burn. She turned to Li Wei, eyes filled with hatred. You fool! Do you think killing me will stop it? Li Wei didn't hesitate. designed to sever spirits from this world. With a final, desperate cry, he drove the dagger straight into the widow's chest. For a moment, time froze, and then she shattered. Her body collapsed into dust. The spirits that surrounded her let out a final, tormented wail before they vanished into the void. Li Wei staggered backward, gasping. It was over, or so he thought. The Nameless One awakens. The shrine trembled violently. Li Wei barely had time to react before he felt it, a crushing, suffocating force pressing down on him. The Nameless One had begun to move. The old woman's face turned ashen. She clutched Li Wei's arm, her voice almost a whisper. We were too late. The shadows of the creature expanded, creeping across the shrine. Where they touched, the wood decayed instantly, crumbling to dust. Li Wei felt his body weakening, his vision blurred. It wasn't just destroying the shrine, it was devouring reality itself. The old woman forced something into his hands, a small golden bell. Its surface was engraved with ancient symbols, glowing faintly even in the darkness. Ring it, boy, now. Li Wei's fingers tightened around the bell. He raised it high and rang it, the final sacrifice. The sound that came from the bell was not natural. It wasn't a chime, it was a scream, not of a human, but of something much, much older. The Nameless One froze. The golden inscriptions on the bell flared to life, their glow cutting through the darkness like fire. The shadows recoiled, twisting violently, and then it began to collapse. Li Wei felt the force of it rushing toward him, pulling at his soul. The old woman turned to him, eyes filled with sorrow. There must be an offering. Li Wei's blood ran cold. He understood. The Nameless One could not be destroyed, only sealed away. And to do that, a soul had to take its place, a sacrifice. Li Wei's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. He had to choose. Before he could react, the old woman smiled at him, a sad, knowing smile, and then she stepped forward, straight into the void. The darkness swallowed her instantly. The air shook. The Nameless One let out a deafening howl, one last, furious cry, before it was dragged back into the abyss. The shrine imploded. The world around Li Wei shattered into nothingness. And then, silence. Epilogue. The price of survival. Li Wei woke up outside the village. The sky was gray, the land eerily still. The shrine was gone, not destroyed, erased. The entire village felt empty, as if it had never truly existed. Li Wei pressed a trembling hand to his chest. The golden bell was gone. So was the old woman. He stared into the empty horizon, his heart heavy with grief. He had survived, but he knew the truth. Somewhere, deep beneath the land, the Nameless One was still there. And one day,